Hey everyone, this is Grandmaster Ben Finegold here with part 2 of our lecture on the isolated queen pawn. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Mr. Michael Saxton. Also sponsored lecture number 1. In lecture number 1, we discussed positions where the side that had the isolated queen pawn was doing quite well. And many of you, especially on YouTube, have seen this video already, and some of you haven't. And this lecture will concentrate on when the isolated queen pawn is bad. And I know for a lot of people, especially club players and the like, they don't like the isolated queen pawn. They don't see the advantages. They just see that it's isolated and not good. And it's not always the case, of course, especially if you saw lecture number 1 last week. You'll see when it's good. And this lecture, we're gonna look at a few games where the side that has the isolated queen pawn doesn't do very well. And as I said last week in my lecture, when you have the isolated queen pawn and you do well, normally it's because of activity and attack. So those games usually end around move 30. When you win with the isolated queen against the isolated queen pawn, because your opponent doesn't have compensation or they have a weak pawn, those games usually take longer to win some kind of late middle game or end game where you have a better pawn structure or you win a pawn. So today's games will be longer typically than last week's games. Okay, so white recaptures on e4. First game we're looking at is Skoko versus Bryan Smith. Bryan Smith is an American grandmaster, and he's paired down. He's playing a low-rated player. You can see white has an isolated pawn, and we're going to see how black takes advantage of that. Black plays knight f6. He's attacking the bishop, and he wants to blockade, something I talked about last week. He wants to stop the pawn from ever moving, and one of the reasons you want to blockade an isolated pawn, typically with a minor piece, either a bishop or a knight, is because when the pawn's not isolated, then if you have a piece in front of a pawn, another pawn can attack it. However, when the pawn is isolated, that means there's no pawns on the adjacent files for white, then that's a pretty safe square in front of the isolated pawn, which means another pawn can't attack it. Okay, so white saved his bishop, and black played bishop e6, blocking the pawn even more. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces controlling the d5 square, making it, virtually impossible for white to ever play the move d5. Okay, bishop b3, trying to get some control of d5. Bishop to d5, blockading the pawn. Bishop e3, queen b6. And here, the advantages that white has from the previous lecture, where we have these squares, e5 and c5, and we can try to attack the black king, we don't see that here. Black king is very safe. There's no attack against the black king. And we can't really put a minor piece on c5. So the only real advantage is our knight can go to e5, but the knight on e5 isn't attacking anything. So with one pair of minor pieces exchanged and the pawn completely blockaded, black just has an advantage here. Okay, white takes on d5 because white doesn't want to get doubled isolated b pawns. Black was threatening bishop takes b3, and white's going to mess up his pawn structure even more. Okay, it's clear if we can take with the knight or the pawn, since we don't want to have an isolated pawn also, we take with the knight. We're blockading the pawn. And as I said last week, although we didn't see any examples of it, now we're seeing examples, we're trading pieces against the isolated pawn, so white doesn't really have any attack. Queen d2, defending the b2 pawn. Queen b4, black wants to trade. The more pieces that are traded, That means white has no attack, white has no initiative, and white just has the weak isolated pawn. Rook d1, rook d8, and white says, I don't want to trade queens, I want to keep pieces on the board. But you can see that white doesn't really have an attack. Rook e8. He tries to get an attack on the king's side with bishop h6. And there is not really any attack, so we play rook e2, attacking the b pawn. Bishop d2, saving the b pawn, attacking the a pawn. b3. Queen goes back to a6. I guess he didn't want to take the a pawn and have his queen very riskily placed. For example, queen takes a2, queen c4, attacks the rook, defends the pawn. Here comes rook a1. It's a little dangerous. So he just played queen a6, a4, rook e8. Black is completely dominating, and the d pawn on d4 is just weak. So black's king is safe. This pawn is weak. It's blockaded. There's the open files that last week white was taking over, but black completely took over the e file. And now b3 is also weak. Black has a perfect pawn structure. Just terrible position for white. And oh, my software stopped working. Hooray. Thanks, ChessBase. Wait for the program to respond. We can try that. That's probably not going to work. This is called the white screen of death. Okay, we will close the program. Since occasionally, like once a month, ChessBase stops working, and then we fix it by coming back. These things happen to the best of us. Okay, let me open the database again. Sorry about that, everybody. Let's see, open. That's why pencils have erasers. Okay, we'll flip the board. All right, and we'll get back to our position. Okay, sorry about that 1 minute delay. Okay, so after rook d8, white played rook e1, queen d3, playing around the isolated pawn. And the d pawn's very weak. White figures if he trades all the pieces, maybe he can get a draw, although since he has a weak d pawn and a weak b pawn, that seems quite unlikely. a6, sort of a waiting move, telling white you don't really have any good moves, so I can do whatever I want. Rook takes, queen f1, again trying to trade. Black doesn't want to trade now, he wants to attack the d pawn. Queen c4, h6, which gets loof for the king and defends the g5 square. So a dual purpose move. And the problem here is, even though black doesn't have an immediate forced win, white can't do anything. Black doesn't have any weaknesses. Black's defended everywhere. And the d4 pawn and the b3 pawn are both very weak. Queen c1, attacking the h pawn. g5, bishop e3, defending the d pawn again. f5, here comes f4. And white sacrifices a piece. Otherwise, f4 is going to be winning. We're finally going to win the isolated pawn. White tries to get counterplay by sacking a piece. Very suspicious. There's not really any counterplay here. Takes another pawn. And black wraps the game up a piece ahead. And black has two passed pawns on the queen side with an extra piece. So the game ended pretty quickly. And here white resigned because knight a3 check is coming. So black had a lot of fun that game. White didn't have any fun. White didn't attack black's king. White didn't get the open E and C files to get pressure. Black blockaded the pawn. And that was a typical way you would see black win against an isolated queen pawn, as opposed to last week where we saw white's advantages. Now, two more games I want to show you are by world chess champion Anatoly Karpov. And in this game, actually, he's playing another world champion, Boris Spassky. And this is the start of their isolated queen pawn position from a queen's gambit. So here, both sides have all of their minor pieces out. But as you can see, black, who has the isolated queen pawn, doesn't have a lot of activity. The bishops are very passive. And for some reason, this rook is on c8 and this rook is on a8. It would be better if this rook went to c8 and this rook could go to e8 and get on the half-open file. Now, of course, as we discussed last week in our lecture, a lot of times when you have the isolated pawn, you're looking to play the move with white d5 or with black d4. Karpov has his rook opposite Spassky's queen, doesn't want black to play d4 and get rid of his weakness, so he plays the move knight f3, blockading the d-pawn and also attacking it. It might be dangerous for white to take this because he's opening up this file, but he can still blockade the pawn, or he could just move his queen and then take the pawn later. So black has to be careful not to lose a pawn right away. Spassky played h6 and said, I dare you to take that pawn because of the, the kind of knight moves that would discover attack the queen. Spassky gets luffed, and more importantly, he prevents white from doing something that would eventually win a pawn. In this position, white would often play bishop g5, attacking the knight, since the knight's defending the pawn, would get rid of the knight, and there's virtually no defense to the pawn on d5. So Spassky says, no, you're not going to do that. I'm going to get luffed from my king, and I'm going to stop bishop g5 forever. Karpov plays knight e5 because, as I said, it's often good to trade pieces when you're facing the isolated pawn. Also, he wants to attack the pawn and blockade it. This vacates the f3 square. The knight was on f3, now it's not. So now white can play bishop f3 later, attacking the pawn again. Bishop e6, defending the pawn, albeit in a passive way. Knight takes c6. And whichever way black takes back, he has a problem. Spassky took back with the rook. Otherwise, it wouldn't be isolated queen pawn anymore, and then the game wouldn't make sense for the lecture. If you take with the pawn, well, then my bishop is controlling this diagonal, so the open B line doesn't really help you. And I can play the move knight a4 to c5, and you basically will have two weak pawns. Now, to be fair, there's a tactical reason that's not really positional like that, why you don't want to take with the pawn, is you're actually allowing bishop to a6, and the rook on c8 is trapped. And I think if bishop a6 didn't exist, probably Spassky would have taken with the pawn, but this wins the exchange. The white bishops control all the squares on the queen side. So he has to take with the rook, then bishop f3, as I mentioned earlier. And one of the things you have to realize when you're facing the isolated queen pawn, which Karpov is doing here, is you don't have to win the pawn right away. The pawn is a permanent weakness. And again, the advantages that black could have, which don't exist here, is we can get a knight to c4 or e4, which we can't do right now, and we could take advantage of our open c line and e line. Well, the e line isn't really open anymore because black put his bishops there. He doesn't have a rook here anyway. And the open c line actually is pretty good for black, so probably Karpov is going to move his queen pretty soon, so the knight's not pinned. Otherwise, that d pawn is permanently weak. It can't play d4. White's defending d4 too much. And white has a lot of pieces attacking d5. Now, this position, as I said earlier, black was trying to prevent bishop g5 takes the knight, which would get rid of some of the defense of the d-pawn. Therefore, one of Karpov's ideas is probably bishop e5 to get rid of the knight that way. So Spassky has to be careful, or pretty soon he's going to lose that d-pawn. Play queen b6. He wants to get his queen off of this line and probably play rook to d8 and defend that way. Bishop e5, as I said earlier, trying to get rid of the knight so he can win the d-pawn. And he plays knight to e4, and he says, haha, I'm pinning your knight, so you can't take with the knight. And if you take with the bishop, my pawn is not isolated anymore, and your queen is stuck defending this b-pawn. So your queen doesn't really have time to take on e4. So knight e4 is sort of a tactical way to try to alleviate all this pressure that white has. Queen e2, he unpins his knight. Now white is just threatening to take the knight on e4. Knight takes, bishop takes obviously. And again, white's doing something good that white wants to do in isolated queen pawn positions. He's trading pieces. When you have the isolated queen pawn, often you have an initiative. You can attack, you can get open files, you can put a minor piece on e4, c4. If the pieces are traded, all we see there is a weak pawn on d5, and now white's threatening to capture it. So rook to d8, as I mentioned earlier. Rook to d3, white wants to play rook to d1 and queen to d2 and have all of his pieces attacking the d-pawn. Rook d6, rook d1. Obviously, white's rooks are attacking a weak pawn. Black's rooks are not active at all. He's just defending it. Rook d7, rook d2. He decides he wants to put his queen on d1 and not put his queen between his rooks. Queen b5, queen d1. So a really nice example of blockading and putting pressure on the isolated pawn, and black not having any counterplay. Black doesn't have an attack against white's king. Black is just going to defend the pawn the rest of the game and hope that he can draw the game. He's hoping he can draw the game. I didn't say he would draw the game, but you have to hope. b6, getting his pawn off of b7, controlling a couple of squares here. Doesn't really do very much. g3, getting loof for the white king. Bishop f8, bishop g2. White is in no hurry. Queen h5, keeping pressure on the d5 pawn. So now black has to be careful because white may try to play the move e4 because the d pawn is pinned sideways, which is unusual. a6, defending his queen. Now the pawn's not pinned. h3, queen c6. Now the pawn's pinned again. King h2. Again, white's not in a hurry. a5. And he plays f4. And actually, in the last game that Bryan Smith won, we saw the same attitude from him. He had the black pieces, and he played g5 and f5, and eventually his opponent unsoundly sacked a piece. And this is the same situation, except Spassky doesn't have a piece sack, that Karpov wants to play the move f5, trapping the bishop on e6. And you can see white's queen is over here, white's bishop is over here. If white's pawn comes, we're getting an initiative on the king's side, and we're also keeping an eye on this really weak pawn. f6, never play f6, so his bishop can drop back. Queen went to d1, attacking, keeping an eye on the d pawn. Queen b5, g4, and Spassky played g5. Probably not a move that I would play. He realized Karpov did this diagonal, could get open towards his king, so he played the move king h1, where his king is much safer. Again, you can see how slow Karpov plays. He's not in a hurry to win the d-pawn. He just wants to make sure that black doesn't have any counterplay. Now black has a lot of weak pawns. I would say all of these pawns are weak. They can't be defended by other pawns. Queen c6, f5, bishop f7, and e4. And we can't let him take on on d5 because we'll just lose a pawn. But there's nothing he can do because it's pinned. He can't take on e4 because this isn't defended sufficiently. Now the reason it's not defended sufficiently is because white played f5, knocking the bishop off of the rook. If we had played e4 here, we could take because the bishop is defending the rook also. That's why Karpov played f5. Notice Karpov played king h1 first, so there's never any checks anywhere. e4, takes on d5, white's up a pawn. Now white has the isolated pawn, but it's an extra pawn. It's a pawn up for nothing. Rook e2, probably wants to take control of the e-file. b5, rook takes e7, sacking the exchange, and d6, so not really sacking the exchange. And this is what Spassky was counting on. Queen c4, if I take the rook, then black is still up in exchange, but we just attack the queen first, and there's no way for the queen to stay on the rook on d3. We can't keep our queen on d3. So after b3, Spassky resigned because he's going to be down a piece. And if he takes this with the idea that the rook on d3 isn't defended, unfortunately, the bishop isn't on f7 anymore, so we make a queen. That's the key variation, I guess. Otherwise, the queen has to move away and my rook is just hanging. So it was funny how the last 5 moves of the game, Karpov had the isolated queen pawn, although it was an extra pawn. And he had the big space advantage on the king's side. In that game, Spassky didn't have a lot of counterplay. Spassky was sort of chilling, and his d-pawn was weak, and eventually it was pinned sideways, then it was pinned vertically, and eventually he lost the pawn. And after that, his position totally collapsed. Probably having a worse position where you have an isolated queen pawn without any counterplay isn't a good idea against somebody like Karpov. That's Karpov's bread and butter. He really wants to get an advantage without any counterplay, and he's good at preventing counterplay. Black didn't have any attack anywhere, so it wasn't good for Spassky. Okay, and let me flip the board. Okay, you can see isolated queen pawn position. This is a game from a world championship match between Korchnoi and Karpov. And they played 2 world championship matches, plus they played a de facto world championship because after Karpov won the first match, which was a semifinal, Fischer refused to play Karpov, so Karpov became world champion. So technically, they played 3 matches for the world championship, technically. This is one of the real world championships with which Fischer wasn't involved. Okay, so obviously white has an isolated queen pawn. White has a lead in development. And as we saw previous week, black has a problem. Problem is this bishop on c8. And last week we were watching black try to fix that. And so black's plans were like knight here to d5, bishop d7 to c6, b6, bishop b7. But Karpov tried something else, and this idea is actually relatively common now. One of the reasons is because of this game, and that is to trade pieces and blockade d5. Karpov played knight h5, which looks sort of odd, and that attacks the bishop on h4 by discovery. And white doesn't really want to take the bishop and trade pieces, and white doesn't want to play bishop g3 and give up the 2 bishops for nothing. So he takes, and Karpov doesn't play the natural queen takes. He plays the much better knight takes because he wants to keep a blockade on d5. Now he's got 3 guys attacking d5. And if he doesn't play b6, he can play bishop d7 to c6, and the knight's not on c6 anymore. So we're blockading again. The knight doesn't necessarily have to go back to f6, losing a tempo. Sometimes it goes to f4 because there's no dark squared bishop for white. So not only did black trade pieces, which he wants to do against the isolated pawn, but he controls d5 as well. Okay, so bishop goes to b3. The bishop is safer on b3, and the rook has a more open file. Bishop c2, queen d3 is an idea sometimes, leading to checkmate. Knight f6, blockading the d5 square again. Knight e5. Knight e5 is one of the advantages we saw last week when white was doing well. Bishop d7. He wants to trade pieces. He says, hey, take my bishop so that you don't have this beautiful knight here anymore, and we trade some more pieces. Korchnoi says, no, I'm not doing that. Rook c8, black's getting his development. Knight e4, trying to get some kind of attack. Karpov trades more pieces. And bishop c6, he says, let's trade some more pieces. I'm not sure if he actually said that, but that's what he was thinking. Knight takes, rook takes. Now in this position, strangely, if white takes the rook, black plays the somewhat unnatural b takes c, which makes this pawn even weaker. We can never play d5. It strengthens d5 for us, opens the half-open b file for us, and now we just attack this pawn. Queen d6, rook d8, knight f5, and the pawn can't be defended, and it can never play d5. Korchnoi didn't like that, so he didn't trade rooks. He played rook c3. He wants to get his rook over to the king's side and get some kind of attack going, which isn't easy to do because he's traded so many pieces. Queen d6, g3 getting luft, rook d8 attacking the pawn, rook d1, rook to b6. He wants to play rook to b4, attack the pawn again. Queen e1, queen goes to d7. Very similar to Karpov's last game. He wants to triple up on the d pawn. He's going to play rook d6. He's got another guy that can attack the d pawn also. He can't play knight f5 right away because we always have to watch for d5. And obviously with the rook here and the bishop here, d5 is a move you have to look out for. You have to be very careful with black that you don't allow d5 and we get rid of the isolated pawn. And white has this really nice bishop. Rook d3, rook d6. And I remember that this was one of my favorite games when I was a kid. And I always wondered later in the game how white got such a bad position where he's defending his d-pawn with his rooks and black is attacking the d-pawn and white has no counterplay. It's very similar to Karpov's game with Spassky we just saw, where he's also tripled up on the d file and the other side has no counterplay. Now, I've had games like this myself, but typically my opponents are much lower rated than I am, and I'm squeezing them and they can't really defend well. Well, in this instance, from this game and the previous game, this is Karpov playing Korchnoi for the World Championship and Karpov playing Spassky, who was a world champion. So even against the best players of the day, Karpov is getting these positions against the isolated queen pawn where his opponent has no counterplay. And he does that by blockading the pawn, attacking the pawn, and trading pieces. Queen e4, queen c6, let's trade queens. Says no, we're not trading. Knight d5, blockading. Queen b6, putting more pressure. Eventually, Korchnoi gives in, realizing how great the knight is. Black is threatening to play knight b4, attacking the rook, and that would finally win the d-pawn. In fact, that would win the game right away, because the rooks would be crushing. For example, let's play a terrible move, something I'm good at, h4. Knight b4 attacking the rook, rook takes d4, and white is completely losing. So he takes the knight, rook takes obviously, rook b3 attacking the queen, queen c6. Now Korchnoi wants to trade queens because he wants to take with the pawn, but nope, we're tripling up on the d pawn, and he plays the move f4. Now f4 is incredibly weakening and looks terrible, but black has a big threat here. It may not be what you think it is. Black is actually not threatening to take this pawn because the queen is defending b7. So if white plays a random move and black thinks he's winning a pawn, he's not, because the b pawn on b7, because the b pawn on b7 is hanging, and this would be a drawn endgame. In fact, white's probably better. What black's threatening is to play the move e5, which we saw in the last game, except Karpov was white, so it was e4, and the d pawn is pinned to the rook on d1. Well, we can't move the rook on d1 because then this pawn is just hanging, and we can't allow e5, so Korchnoi has to play the super weakening f4 just to prevent e5. But now white's king is just awful. b6, stopping rook takes b7. Now we can take the pawn on d4 if we'd like. Rook b4, defending the pawn. b5, a4, he takes. In this position, black wants to play a5 attacking the rook, then b4, and then the d pawn is hanging, so a4 is sort of forced. Black's a pawn up now, but it's doubled. Queen a3, a5, wins his pawn back. Now with the king open, we can infiltrate, queen to e2. We're still putting tremendous pressure on this pawn. And you can see black's king is safer, black has a worse pawn structure, white has a worse pawn structure, and white doesn't really have any counterplay yet. Rook d2, defending everything, defending the d pawn, defending the b pawn, and stopping black from playing queen e2. And the move e5. And e5 could have been played on the previous move also, but he was busy defending his pawn. You see that the d pawn is still pinned, and we're just opening white's king even more. Fe, rook e5. White's king has basically no protection. If it was black's turn to move, black actually has mate in two moves. Rook e1 check, and queen f1 checkmate. If we take the rook, rook takes d2, our king is not looking good. If we don't take the rook, rook e1 check. So he played queen a1, defending against rook e1 check. Queen e8, a brilliant move, threatening rook e1 check again, winning the queen. Again, if you take the rook, rook takes d2, white's king just has no defense. What's funny is black is taking advantage of white's isolated pawn, and white still has the isolated pawn, even though we're deep into the endgame. And you can see the difference between this week and last week. Last week, the side with the isolated pawn was getting an attack on the king, and this week, the king is very safe, and that's why the side against the isolated pawn is doing better. The black king is very safe, the white king is not, and we're taking advantage. Maybe I cheated a little bit by showing games that Karpov won. Karpov was pretty good, and when his opponent had a weakness, he was good at punishing the weakness and not letting his opponent get counterplay. So he takes the rook, rook takes. Boy, that's a pretty bad king on g1. Now, if it's black's turn to move, which it's not, black can play queen takes e5, winning a pawn, or black can play queen c6 or queen a8, threatening queen g2 mate. So black has some nice queen moves coming up. He takes on a5. That defends two of the three threats. Can't play queen a8, can't play queen e5. So plays queen c6. Now he's threatening queen g2 mate. Now, if we play queen to f1, for example, stopping queen g2 mate, then queen b6 check wins our rook. So he played rook a8 check, king here, and Karpov had to see that against queen b1 check, that he could play g6. And that would be the end of the checks. Now, once again, if we play queen f1, we simply lose our rook on a8. So he played queen b1 check, g6, queen f1. And the idea is, because he forced the move g6, if we take the rook, we have queen takes f2 check. And you can't run away. Obviously, you can draw. You can't run away because the d2 rook is hanging, attacking the rook, attacking the king. And white would win. So that's pretty tricky on Korchnoi's part, forcing g6, stopping mate, and threatening queen takes f7 mate. Pretty good. Unfortunately, we can zigzag to victory. When I say unfortunately, unfortunately for white. And what's funny is, somehow, white's traded his isolated pawns. White had an isolated d pawn for most of the game. Now he has an isolated e pawn and an isolated b pawn. Queen c5 check. The king has to go to h1. Queen d5 check. And now we're going to play rook to d1, pinning the queen to the king. So he resigned, but if he plays king to g1, then rook d1 wins. Very nice game by Karpov. And Korchnoi got some counterplay at the end when it was too late, when black had all these forced wins. So after queen d5 check, he resigned. And those are three examples of the side having the isolated pawn losing. This is the isolated queen pawn being bad. Sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's good. Last week we saw what was good about it. This week we saw what was bad. When you don't have counterplay, when the pieces are being traded, when you don't have an attack, when you don't have access to these squares in your opponent's position, e5 and c5, you have isolated d pawn, then the side without the isolated d pawn is going to get an advantage. And here, by trading pieces, we stop the attack, we put pressure on the d pawn, we blockaded the d pawn, and even worse for the opponent is they're spending time defending the d pawn. They want to be doing something else. When you're playing chess, you don't want to spend a lot of time defending your weakness. You say, well, it's weak, but I'm doing other things. But if you're not doing other things, and you're putting 2 or 3 pieces, or sometimes 4, to defend a weak pawn, that's not what you're looking for. So excellent examples of how to beat the isolated queen pawn. I hope you watch both lectures, the winning with the isolated queen pawn, losing with the isolated queen pawn, and you can see the differences. I explained some of them. You can see others from the games. And I want to thank our sponsor again, Michael Saxton, for sponsoring the isolated queen pawn. Hopefully, you're not prejudiced against one or the other. I'll play either side of isolated queen pawn. I just have to understand the ideas. I have to understand what's good about having it, what's bad about having it, and hopefully by watching the 2 lectures, part 1 and 2, you guys get a good idea also. If you'd like to sponsor a lecture, please contact Karen, and just tune in Monday nights if you want to watch live. Otherwise, wait a while and watch them on YouTube, like a lot of you are doing right now. Thanks for watching. Thanks to our sponsor. Thanks for supporting our channel. I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold. Until next week's lecture, bye everybody.